Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me back. I'd love to start this presentation with a huge thank you. I have never created a presentation like this, 3-day sprint, agile, completely crowdsourced with multiple authors. And it's been an extraordinary experience. And the thank you goes to each of you in the audience. Also, an apology. I got to as many sessions as I could, but there were some great things that I maybe missed out or didn't get exactly the quote or maybe missed the nuance. So apologies in advance if it didn't quite capture what it was that you wanted to convey. But I hope this memorializes in some way some of the amazing experiences, thoughts, ideas, and concepts that I've had the privilege to be part of over the last 3 days. So let's dive in. I am the data. In trying to work out how to summarize the last 3 days, I think this presentation's had maybe 5 titles, and it's changed maybe twice a day. And the reason in the end we settled I am data is because it's been so hard in so many conversations to work out the difference between the human, the digital twin, the service provider, the service that's being provided, the data that it needs, and everything seemed to come back to, if we really want a human-centric model, then we have to understand that in every moment, we are creating, we're generating that data. And so how do we find a way to fit into this ecosystem? So let's strap in, and for 25 minutes or so, let's take a wild ride across 7 subject areas. So again, trying to synthesize all of the things that we've done over the last few days into some sort of idea categories. So what I'd love to cover is kids, what I'm calling the data blur, enter the developers, to sell or not to sell, that is the question. Build it, keeping it real, and where we stand as a precursor to where we go. So we started off by watching the film, many of us seeing the film The Great Hack, and I think one of the things maybe to start acknowledging right up, we're living inside the matrix, right? So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, or we see in sci-fi, or we think is in the future, it's just not in the future anymore. It's here. It's in the here and now. And this is a gorgeous slide that ODI were generous and shared with me. They have in their office a stuffed cat that's hanging from the ceiling to remind them every day that they're being watched. And I just thought it was a kind of cute way for us to stay connected with the fact that there's someone watching. So if we're already in the matrix and there are lots of really great things that are happening and there are some challenging things that are happening and there are things that we want to change to have a better future, what is the future that we imagine and that we want? And I would like to think by the end of this presentation that some of the things that you've witnessed over the last few days give you a lot more confidence about what that future might look like. So where do we start? I have to say that this has been one of the most inspiring topics that I have seen spoken about in the last few years in the whole MyData community. A startling statistic, about 1/3 of the people online are under 18, and you may have heard this in one of the forums. You ask big tech how many kids they have as customers. They say they don't because the credit cards or kids lie about their age or whatever come from parents. Then you ask kids and they have all of those big tech apps. So we know we've got this big gap. Some things that are really concerning, about 50% of teens admit that they actually feel addicted to their device. And I was privileged to do some work in the insurance design space recently with some amazing professionals that are saying they're just so worried about the stuff that they're seeing coming through in insurance claims connected to young people, and specifically around bullying, depression, self-harm. So if there is one thing, and there are many things to take away, but if there is one thing that we have to start getting right, it's this relationship between the online world and our children. So some of the reasons why we don't have the internet we want, and we haven't architected things in the way that we might think are optimal, is because of these issues. And they're real. And you understand why governments and security agents are concerned around what's going on, whether or not it's drug trafficking or money laundering or pedophiles. We know these things are concerns, right? And we know that it holds us back from maybe designing the distributed, privacy-enhancing environment we want. But let me show you somebody who I guarantee this is not an issue for. This is day one for her. She's none of those things. Just think about that for a second. If we could start to design from here. And yeah, of course, some people may grow up and they may be involved in many of those things we're worried about. And we could have ways to manage that. But we shouldn't be putting off the fact that for her, she should be able to start with a clean slate. And that's what really excited me about one of the things, and if Ian is in the room, I'm not sure if Ian is in the room, there weren't enough people in Ian's session. I don't know if you've heard about DFK or DIDS for Kids. If you haven't, it's worth looking at. It's basically saying, how do we get this clean slate for children, this next generation, so they can start off with the architecture that's going to serve them through their life. Unfortunately, I didn't get to the ADA session, but I did see some of the artifacts in the room, which is this whole idea around tracing what it might look like for a child's digital life. And I saw some really beautiful artifacts. So if there's one big takeaway, we have a chance to fix some things for an emerging generation. Next big idea. I'm calling it the data blur, because this is where we start to have the convergence of operators, service providers, data access, data processing. So, Michael, thank you. This is a statistic that he shared with me yesterday, that around 2025, it's predicted that we're going to interact with around 4,800 times a day with some sort of IoT device, right? So maybe every 48 seconds. So, is consent going to work in that model? I mean, can you imagine? Like, it's just not going to work, right? So I think one of the things that we may need to start thinking about is how we move the conversation from consent to the surfacing of consequences, which is, did you realize your health provider has been monitoring, or the city has been monitoring your heart rate for the last 5 days? After 6 days, it blah, blah, blah. Or do you realize that you're at home now and your employer is still tracking? Or you get to your door and your door reminds you that you're switching out of one role in life into another. So we really have to start thinking about this, and we'll talk a little bit about design. But yes, there has to be explicit informed consent, but we have to find a better design pattern. Smart city, so this convergence of the data blur. What I loved about the Helsinki presentation was, instead of the usual smart city, it was about looking at the idea of a proactive city, how you start to personalize services that are provided in a MyData human-centric way. And so the presentation, for those of you that were able to see it, was around what are some of the things that we could do specifically to actually serve the citizen or the inhabitants of Helsinki in a more proactive way. Could we make education easier, pre-enroll, advise citizens that their child is eligible for a particular area. For people with a particular illness or in an aged care, remind people that their doctor's appointment is coming up. So there are lots of amazing things, but what factored in that is choice. There's a big data blur here. There's a big data blur around where that data comes from, how it's used, how it's processed, governance, separations of concerns. And if we got it right, it could actually be amazing, because one of the statistics was the cost of, I think it's something like 80% of the cost of healthcare comes from, I think, less than 10% of the population. So what if we could reverse that? So this is not just about managing costs, but what if we could increase the well-being of the population? And yeah, we've got some creepy cool lines to kind of work through in this blur, which really comes back to this idea of transparency, design, and choice. So we jump from there to health. And some of the things, and there are lots of sessions around health. I'm going to summarize some of the outtakes. There are lots of technical approaches. So one of the challenges is that we still have, there's so much to do in this area, whether or not you're doing it by type of device, tracking, health, disease, longevity, well-being, changing behavior. So how do we start to align the tech in ways that actually line up with use cases? Are there particular patterns that work with types of disease or early warnings or early signs in terms of lifestyle that may be pointing in a particular direction? Is that something that you're wearing? Is that something you're swallowing? Is that something that you opt into being monitored by? And one of the things that came out in one of the sessions from the founder of, is it SensorTrend, that this is somebody that has first-hand experience with diabetes. And I think one of the things we have to be doing in any of the design, MyData design perspectives, is somebody that actually is living with whatever it is, whether it's diabetes or looking after an aged parent or trying to enroll a child in school or trying to manage their well-being. We need to have people that actually understand what it is to live with something and what freedom would look like if they had the data and information. Also that business and governance models need to go beyond the technical solution. I think that's true across a lot of things that I've seen this week. The tech in some ways is the easier part. I think maybe next year we'll start to see more discussion across the cross disciplines, again, more the ethics and the governance, because the tech is really starting to mature, and now we need to know the right way to use that. And then there was another outtake in one of the sessions that, particularly in healthcare, that differential privacy may be one of those things that could be a key to actually unlocking patterns and helping with insight without necessarily putting people at risk. Onto mobility, still part of the data blur. If we think of the city of Helsinki and health and mobility, that could be a situation where all of those things are converging because you need to get to a doctor, you've been prompted to get to a doctor, and the city is helping you in some way, possibly. So thank Paul. I think Paul had to head back to Belgium. He shared with us the work that he's doing with the city of Antwerp right now around looking to give each citizen or inhabitant what they call a My Mobility Pass. So they're building an ecosystem of transport partners, and the idea is to give everyone the ability to control and choose what data they want to share for a connected experience. But what sits underneath this is that Antwerp apparently is one of the most congested city in the EU, and there are obviously environmental issues, there's time issues, there's impact at work, health, picking up kids after school, you name it. And so the idea is if people had better access to their data and they're able to bring that data together in a way to even look at alternative methods of transport or mobility, would that actually help across many things, including sustainability? But I think for that to work, or any of this data blur, I think one of the things we've got to be thinking about is how do we help manage that risk? So we have to get into that value chain in a way where we help manage that risk. We have to participate in that. And by manage that risk is not consent, set and forget, but how is it that we are able to collaborate through what that experience it might be. I'm happy for this information to be shared, and the minute I get off this bus or stop riding this bike or get to my front door, the data just stops and disappears. I really think this is something we can solve, but I think the data blur is something we need to be thinking about. Next big topic, enter the developer. I wasn't at MyData last year, and I have to say one of the things I've noticed the most since 2017 is, what year is it? Is that I think we're making a lot of progress on some of the building blocks. I was really inspired by a lot of the things that I saw. It wasn't so much that there was some super fantastic cool tech. It was that there were lots of cool things that put together could start to help that baby and the architecture we want. And again, I mentioned in the opening Union Square Ventures that wrote a blog this week around, yeah, look, we could force big tech to break up, or we could just stop the bad behavior and allow us to start logging in with our own credentials or have better access to our data. So some of the things that I saw, just in summary, increasing availability of developer tools, fantastic. More plumbing, more bits and pieces that could help enterprise, and as Lucas mentioned, partners actually integrate. I'll talk a little bit about SSID, DID, back to the kids thing. Did I mention the kids thing? Can I mention the kids thing again? GDPR.dev, some really interesting things around, again, these component parts, and also some consent plugins that can actually take existing services and make those more transparent. The only call out I would say here, let's make sure we're building the same thing. Like, are we all coloring in the same elephant, or are we all biting from the same elephant, whatever example you want to use. If we're all working on parts of the puzzle, let's make it sure it's the same puzzle. Apologies in advance to anyone doing the hard, deep, incredibly technical work in SSID and standards. What I tried to do in this slide was SSID 123, SSID for dummies. At the top, there's me, and there's some big mega corporation. In the middle, there was me, and someone came along to try and make it easier. And where we're hoping to get is there's me, and there is a peer, which could be a person, an organization, my employer, a hospital. But the call out here is there's amazing stuff happening in this area. It's getting traction. But what we need is we need voices, we need voting, we need people to contribute to those standards to make this interoperable, adoptable, and possible. So the big call out here is this great work happening at WC3. There are many people that presented about SSID over the last couple of days. Reach out, find somebody. If you have a voice or a thought about how things should be voted from a standards point of view, please, please, please get involved. And I would say, summarizing that, we want things that are open, we want interoperability, we want standards. Yes, we all want to compete and win if we're building stuff, but the bottom line is, if the Meccano set all fits together, or the Lego set all fits together, then there's this really big pie, and there's lots of opportunity. If we keep building in silos, then the ability to scale up will be, it'll take a long time, and something guaranteed will come over the top. The other thing that I think that's worth thinking about, and I'll put my hand up here. When we came to the first MyData conference in 2016, we were thinking this is about moving people to new tech. And I would say our journey over the last few years is saying, no, we need to take the capability we're building and bring that to where people are. So we've got to find ways to take the stuff that we are creating that is going to give that human-centric approach and take it to where the audience already is, which is part of the reason why I love this API component, login, this modular approach, because we've got a much better chance of winning by taking components to where people already are doing things than asking people to completely stop what they're doing and start doing something completely new. Blockchain, a couple of years ago, blockchain was going to do everything. It was going to, hoover my floor, cure cancer, wash my dishes. It did none of those things. The great thing that I think is there's a real maturity around how I've seen blockchain talked about over the last few days. It's dropping down into the stack as a really important component. It's being talked about as a technical component that can actually help. And I think that's really healthy. Yes, there's a place for it. It's really important. But it's much better to be having a conversations with, hey, what's the use case? Does blockchain work? Oh, it does. Oh, it doesn't. Okay, what are the alternatives? What's the consensus model? Who needs to use this? Should this be private? Should this be public? Should this be permissioned? So I think there's been some more mature conversations, which is great. And I think the other thing is moving away. I've heard less of, we have the answer, than, look, we're part of this ecosystem, or we have a part, which I think is a really, really healthy conversation. Next big concept, to sell or not to sell, that is the question. So went to a number of sessions around this idea of who owns the data, or should we be selling data, should we be monetizing data? And I've been privileged through rebooting Web of Trust and a few forums over the last few months to start doing a little bit of thinking and writing around what's the legal framework or the model that we need to recognize that maybe I am data, I do want value. For some people, that value may be financial. For me, my parents live on the other side of the world. One is in aged care, one is at home. My dad's had a fall a number of times. I would pay just about anything to be able to monitor whether he's got out of bed and he's not lying on the floor, or any kinds of things from the other side of the world. And so if somebody offered me money versus the ability to take care of my father remotely, I want that focus to be on services. But that might not be what works for everybody. And so there's an argument, and I understand it, and it kind of makes sense. Look, big tech's making all this money. Shouldn't we be having a piece of it? And so maybe yes. Maybe the answer is yes. On the same panel, this quote I loved, I had to get it verbatim. Yeah, look, there was a time in history where we used to also sell people, and it wasn't such a happy time. So again, it's finding this balance. And I think one of the things that we just have to face head on is that we have a difference of opinion in terms of models. I saw either in language or perspectives between Europeans and people from North America. Some of it's cultural, some of it's the way business models work, some of it's the way that laws work, this idea, tension between property or rights management. And the other thing I want to acknowledge is the third way. I had the privilege of seeing some really interesting things presented from Japan, where this third idea of trust banks or a trusted operator that is actually part of that more as a regulated mediator. So I don't know whether there is a single way, but I think that we really need to work through some of the tensions between these things so that we can define what it actually means to be human-centric and what some of these business models might be. And I think cultural differences, how do we reconcile those? I mean, should MyData reach an official position on this? I certainly gravitated to a lot of the things from a rights perspective that you see articulated from a European point of view, but that could just be because it aligns with my, my personal values. It doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean that other models are right or wrong, but I do think we need to be thinking about it because it will start to impact design, commercial models, access, return. Next big idea. We're here from the government and we'd like to help you. So I was really inspired this morning by Alexander Stubbs' presentation, the keynote this morning. What I found arresting was just straight out. AI and this digital revolution is going to change everything, everything. Everything's up for grabs in some way. And he talked about the fact that we typically either respond optimistically, pessimistically, or we're benign. And I think the truth of it is that there's this big benign hump in the middle where most people have really no idea. Parents don't know what their kids are doing every day in terms of the tech they're using. They don't understand when they buy an IoT device and plug it in that baby monitor is streaming to some online service accidentally because they haven't set it up right, or they gave the babysitter the code to their door or their Wi-Fi and now that's permanently with, like, blah, 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 whatever you think it is. It's that there is, you know, smart home, smart car, smart life, smart door, blah, all of those things. You know, there's just so much for people to start to integrate and manage in their life. And so I think most people in the short term become quite overwhelmed. It'll be easier for young people because they'll just grow up. They won't get a physical key. They'll grow up with digital keys and they'll have the same kind of confidence that maybe we've had in the analog world. But we've got this crossover period. And so, again, Alexander called out the 3 superpowers that are working on this. He was very direct in terms of saying we need to be working with each of those. We need to understand what China is doing. We need to understand what's happening in the United States. But he said fundamentally, if we take a human-centric approach, then we need this to be controlled in some way in the context of the EU. And he called out that the EU is a regulatory superpower. And so we may not have digital borders, but we may need to be thinking about AI borders or behavioral borders, or at least understand what it means to bring technology in from other jurisdictions that may not be aligned in terms of values or where it sees human agency. So following on from that, on day one, there was the NGI, the Next Generation Internet workshop. And for those of you that don't know, this is an initiative in the EU to start funding and helping to prototype and build this next generation internet. And they were very, very kind to share some of the lessons learned. This is a small summary of things that came out of the workshop and the lessons. I'm sure if you reached out to them, you would be able to get the full outtakes. But just some of the things that I thought were really relevant to us as an audience. That the aim here is to reshape the internet, and everyone acknowledges that this is a huge ambition. And obviously major investment is needed. One of the things I love about the EU, 28 or 27 member states that are saying, look, we have to do this in a collective way. We need to cascade that funding into innovation. We understand the risks of fragmentation, so we've got to put that money where we think it's going to make a difference. And when it comes to human centricity, Europe clearly needs to lead the way because it's part of the values. Also, in terms of reshaping the internet, it can't be done by technologies alone. So again, this idea of this integrative approach, super important. And beyond the hype, back to what Alexander was talking about, AI, blockchain, IoT, all these technologies, everything's creating, generating, processing, using, collecting, reusing, resharing data. So if we as humans are data, how do we build this internet of humans? So how do we start from this design perspective? And again, I would say some of the technology stuff is the easiest part. How we then start to apply it to us every day is where the challenges are. And then following on from that, I hope I say this correctly, Vakke, is that right? Yeah. The Finnish state development company also launched over the last couple of days information around its accelerator to focus on building MyData-related innovation, certainly for Finland, but who knows, the next amazing human-centric unicorn starts in Finland and travels to the rest of the globe. So I think what's really interesting there is, again, this is a very different type of approach that you see in Europe. You know, I started Miko in Australia. I applied a number of times early days for innovation funds and tech funds and government grants, and there isn't anywhere near the sophistication, understanding, or focus that you find in Europe around really leading the way. Next big idea, build it. I wanted to include this because, first of all, I wanted to acknowledge a lot of stuff has already been built. And people have built, thrown it out, are learning, refining, redesigning. So I really wanted to acknowledge all the work that has already been done and what a huge contribution that is to the work that we're doing now and the work that we will do. So I wanted to call out some of the building blocks that will help continue to accelerate that building. So first of all, MyData operators. I think Joss was generous enough to share some of the things that they've been focusing on out of the workshops over the last couple of days, getting much clearer around the role of a MyData operator, getting clearer around the network approach, aiming to make the network more concrete over this next 12 months, and then have some really foundational things to share through 2020. Carrying on from that, it's been very much a self-organized group, which is great, but one of the things that determines the quality of any group are the people that show up and contribute. And I know particularly people that are either juggling day job or startup or trying to do this alongside of all the other things in life. If we want this human-centric approach, then we need to, as humans, contribute to it. Need to be more focused on the policy areas, specifically around the EU, and have the opportunity to use the creation of the MyData operator white paper to develop new ways of working. So if you're not involved in a MyData hub, then here's your opportunity. They're springing up all around the world, and even if it's just reviewing content as it's created and contributing, that's great. Also part of building is portability. So making that hello world really easy. We've got this crazy thing that all this data is being collected, but actually getting it is not as easy as we would like it to be. I think Dave Birch is at Cybos this week, and he tweeted the other day that one of the big banks, I think it might have been ING, I'm not sure, said, well, if Google has all our banking data, why can't we have all of Google's data? Well, they should have been at MyData, because I was really impressed to hear the privacy team from Google talking around the mission for the data transfer project, making data portability radically easier. And the thing that I was really inspired by was something that they were quite upfront about, is that if you have lock-in, it really means you probably don't have to innovate. If you're locking in a customer in any way, then innovation tends to decline. But if you don't have lock-in, then what you have to be doing is innovating so that customers love you. And I think this is going to be one of the hallmarks for us to succeed in from a human-centric way. This is the competition we're up against. We have to make experiences beautiful, repeatable, sticky, and I don't mean in a creepy, manipulating way, but we need people to go, wow, I love that outcome, and I didn't have to give away, everything, put myself at risk, data, all the rest of it. So if you're not aware of this project, then please check it out. Which leads to some of the design considerations. So I know there are a number of sessions around design. If we understand anything about UX and design, particularly the rise of dark patterns, design really more and more is shaping behavior. We do things because they've been designed to make us do those things. And so I think there are two things to call out here. One, the governance and ethics of design is as critical as the tech itself. Are we designing really to empower people? And the other thing is, the flip side of that is, the tech might really work. You may have the best key store there is, but if you have to be a PhD in cryptography to get the thing to work, it's not going to be adopted. So how do we get this balance right between designing for the kinds of patterns that are empowering, the tech that is reliable, but with the UX and the UI that is intuitive and embraceable? So I think we also need to focus on increasing the ethics and transparency of the way we're trying to change and shape behaviour. If I go back to that idea of the city of Helsinki saying, we noticed you missed your doctor's appointment. For someone like me, that would be fantastic because I forget 100 things a day. But maybe there are some things I don't want to be reminded about. And so how do you make a decision around the things that you do want to be reminded about and you don't, and we make sure that we get this dotted line between super creepy and super cool, that we get the balance of that right. And I have to say, that leads me to the last session that I was in this afternoon, which I would sum up as the as-a-service world. And I have to say, I felt really flat and awful after that session. Because the stuff that's going on in the gig economy or the data-driven economy or the as-a-service world is really alarming. And I had the privilege of meeting this week Nigel Cameron in Brussels that spearheaded a think tank in Washington for a number of years. And he was chatting to me about some papers that he's written around what happened for many, many, many millions of people after the Industrial Revolution. There was a decade or two where people didn't find work, where factory jobs went to children, where family men were not employed. And yes, we talk about the Industrial Revolution and all the upside, but there were some really bleak times on the back of that innovation. And one of the things that I fear is that we're really living in that time right now. And what I found arresting about that session is that we have all of this data, when we use one of these as-a-service apps, whether it's Uber or whatever the case may be, we can see our ride, we can see how much it costs, we can see how we rated. But do we stop and think that some of these rating systems is the difference between somebody putting food on their table or not? And that's for real. The difference between a rating 4-point-something and a 5 is whether or not people work. And I was in Amsterdam recently and I had the nicest driver and he said to me, please, I need a 5. And he was brilliant. I said, absolutely. And he said, I had some drunk people in the car over the weekend and he said they were mucking around and I asked them not to. And he said, I got a series of 1 ratings and I'm worried I'm going to lose my job. Just think about what that's like. You're doing a great job, you pick somebody up, they're drunk, they're being violent, they're in the back of your car, you're scared, you turn around and you ask them to just calm down, and the next minute you get a rating that says that you can't continue to work. And this is the stuff that we've designed. We've designed our society for this right now. So we really, really need to be thinking about this. And I have such a dilemma with Uber because I am yet to find a driver that's not delightful. Yeah, every now and then you find somebody but these are people generally that speak 3, 5, 7 languages, who are driving a car because they have found something that they can do, or they are juggling 5 things. And this is a reality, and the way we rate these services is absolutely instrumental to human-centered participation. So I think it's a really, really important thing for us to be thinking and maybe talking next year around design patterns. Very important. Next big topic, keeping it real. More discussions this year on the maturity on business and industry participation and commercial models. This is really important. As Luke said, we've got to have the services that are going to integrate the cities, the mobility, the healthcare providers, the financial institutions, the insurance companies. We need them at the table. If we get to a place where we've got data in a state that we want to share it and it is going to be meaningful and it is going to help our life, we need to know that there are services that will equally be respectful and will help us achieve those services. So the other thing that's been great is people being kind enough to share the results of pilots, proof of concepts and learning, and I was very pleased to see more of that. A couple of the other initiatives that popped up was the Me2B Alliance out of United States, this idea of ensuring human dignity and agency with the purchase or the relationship with products and services with 3 really simple principles. Really nice. I'm in charge. If it's me to be and I'm sharing my data, then I have some agency and rights. I'm going to play nice. I'm not going to game the system. And if I'm not in this, if you're getting data about me from someone else, then it's not me to be. So these may be just really simple ideas, but they help the design pattern. Who pays? I know we've been talking about this for some time. What's the commercial models? We're starting to see commercial models form. But what is the value that's created? Is it financial value? Is it environmental value? I mean, what's the value to the city of Helsinki if you're able to make an increase of 10% longevity, 20%? You save the life of a child. You keep an aging parent at home for a longer period of time. I mean, when we start to think about well-being, sustainability, the environment, this is where I get super excited around a data-driven society. So, who pays? How do we manage the economic value? What's the upside of solving some of these big ecosystem problems? If we go back to the data blur, what happens when we find the right human-centric way to bring mobility, city, health together? Mobility, city, education, mobility, city, career, mobility, city, music, whatever it is. What does that data blur do if we are able to do that in a way that is human-centric? And bringing these different parts of life together, again, back to the idea of the jigsaw puzzle, building the same thing. And how do you measure prevention? Again, thinking of the insurance company I did some work with recently, where they said, a lot of their statistics have been around the number of claims they pay every year. And they're seeing an alarming increase in suicide and teenage harm. What if they were able to measure the decrease in those things? Their metrics completely changing. And I mean, it's easy sometimes to say, oh, look, this is the economic value. But, what's the value of being able to say to a parent, we've helped with this issue, surfacing this bullying issue for your child, or, and how do we do that? I know as those words are coming out of my mouth, I'm thinking, privacy, whose role is it? It's so blurry, but, you hear stories where people are aware of something and it smacks them in the face and they go, wow, that was right in front of me and I didn't see it. And now we can deal with it as a family, as a city, as a community, whatever the case may be. So I don't even know how we begin to measure the upside of prevention. Are we listening enough to industry? Do we need more industry here? The B2B needs. Do we understand what a MyData operator together with a mobility operator together with a city needs? What are the handoff? What's the minimum collection for the maximum value? Do we have enough of those conversations going on? Do we need more of those here at MyData next year? Governance. Lots of cool stuff happening, parts of the jigsaw puzzle coming together, but do we have the right governance frameworks in place? And two initiatives that I had the privilege of seeing is a new governance for personal data group. Again, check it out, see if you can contribute, see if you can give some feedback. This is the aim to try and harmonize the governance framework across the emerging technology we're building. And then some beautiful work from ODI around these maps, helping people make sense of the data landscape, and really beautiful visual things that help the average person understand what are the emerging things. And I would encourage you to reach out to ODI. They have a whole range of these maps. They're beautiful, they're graphical, they're really easy to understand, and they're great education tools. So what fundamentally has to happen for us to get into the value chain? If I am data, if you are data, if we are data, How do we start to design so that we are managing this from a design point of view, an ethics point of view, a value chain point of view, a participation point of view, a consent point of view? And I know that that's complex, and it would be nice just to go off and code something and ship it, because that's so much easier. But I think that's one of the challenges for us as a community, and that's kind of what went wrong with, first version of our digital world. Was we did build things in silos, or we didn't think of an internet design for a child, or we didn't think of the kind of commercial models that would keep things fair and democratic. And the fact that we talk about those things mean that we have some responsibility to contributing to solving those things. So in closing, I think where we're at right now is we have some choices ahead. I think the MyData community is reaching an inflection point. It's maturing. We have really amazing representation across many different disciplines. So we need to start thinking about what this actually means. And it's one of the things that I talked about in the opening keynote. We think that tech is neutral. It's not. Tech is incredibly political. If I can give somebody a rating of 1 and that person loses their job, that's political. If I have the power to be a complete, whatever you want to call it, in the back of somebody's car that's trying to earn a living, and impact them, that's an incredibly powerful tool. So we need to think really carefully around the power and responsibility that we have. And again, back to the opening keynote, when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. As much as we try, there will be some unintended consequences for what we design and build. But we should be prepared to accept those consequences, take it on the chin, and know as a community how we're going to clean those things up, or learn, or iterate, or fix. Because if we're not prepared to address the shipwrecks, then we have no right to be building the ships. So what is the mission of MyData? Have we scared people with all of the great hack, and, are people too worried now about sharing their data, being connected? Have we made it easier for people to be proactive and involved and participate in the data economy? So I think these are some of the questions that face us now. I would argue that MyData, this logo, this icon, has already created a sense of iconic trust mark. Maybe it means the same thing to all of us, or it means a different thing. But I think one of the things as a community we need to define is, what does it mean with some of these questions that are surfacing? Are we clear on what this community means? We can't be all things to all people. That's one thing that I absolutely have learned over this journey of working on developing technology. Every time you say you're not something, it really opens the door to what you are, and it actually strengthens a community. And the clearer that we get around what it is we stand for, what are our values, what are our guiding principles, I guarantee that we'll have more attracting power. It will bring more people to the community. And for those that go, we'll just be really clear around the things that we're focused on. So it's not a bad thing, it's a really empowering thing. And I think that's some of the things that we must do to reconcile some of the questions that have come out of the last 3 days. So back to this room. I really believe that over the last 3 days, the people that have passed through, presented on these stages here, have the power, have the insight, have the ability to shape this world that we want to live in. I really do. And so I feel that responsibility between now and any of the events that MyData are doing next year, the standards working groups, everything, that's our opportunity to keep contributing. And I'd like to close with a beautiful thought that came from one of the panels from Valentina Pavel. I think the question is, what's the future that we want to live in? Thank you.